All right. Well, first of all, I want to say to each and every one of you, thank you for this great opportunity for us to be able to sit down and really have an opportunity to have an open and truthful discussion about many of the events that are happening in our communities. And I want to introduce by introducing myself, and that my name is James Yapias. I am the education chair for the NAACP of Salt Lake branch. And about this, our evening event, uh, what we have today is we have a number of panelists with us. But before I do that, I would like to say that the community groups represent Juneteenth celebration panel. This is our Juneteenth celebration panel, Understanding Critical Race Theory. It's sponsored by the NAACP of Salt Lake Branch and the Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Inc., and supported by Better Utah Institute, ACLU of Utah, and the NAACP Ogden Branch. So, with critical race theory, CRT, under attack, Utahns are invited to learn and understand what CRT is and its origin. Panelists tonight will discuss how CRT acknowledges that the legacy of slavery, segregation, and imposition of a second-class citizenship on Black Americans and other people of color continues to permeate the social fabric of this nation. And so with us, we have four wonderful, wonderful individuals that will share with us their experiences, their thoughts, and our panelists are incredible. And so let me do some introduction of them. Dr. Eric Bybee. Eric Bybee Rees Bybee is an assistant professor in the Department of Teacher Education in the David O. McKay School of Education at BYU, Brigham Young University. He teaches courses of multicultural education. Dr. Bybee research's interests include social and cultural foundations of education, Latinx education, teacher education, and identity, agency, and social movements in education, and stem from his experiences in former New York City as a public teacher. We also have Dr. Kathleen Christy, equity consultant, coach, and professional developer, retired educator with over 42 years of experience in the public sector. Has spent many years as an equity director, assistant superintendent, educational equity in the Salt Lake City School District. Currently consults with schools, districts, and organizations in equity. We also have Tamara N. Stevenson, who's Dr. Stevenson, Vice President, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Chief Diversity Officer, Associate Professor of Communications, Diversity Scholar Network member, University of Michigan's National Center of Institute Diversity. Also, with us, we have Dr. Jackie Thompson. Dr. Thompson is a former Director of Equity, Department of Davis School District. She's a board member of the Governor's Multicultural Commission. She's a motivational speaker and diversity trainer. Welcome to each and every one of you. Thank you for being with us. I appreciate you guys. So for tonight's panel discussion, I prepare 6 questions for you, and then we'll have an opportunity for each and every one of you. We'll have about a minute to 2 minutes for an open discussion. And so let me start with question number 1. We'll just get right into it. With so much talk about critical race theory, would you tell our audience in 2 minutes or less, what is CRT? I will come back to each and every one of you for further details. Let's start with Dr. Jackie Thompson. You're muted, Dr. Thompson.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I will try this again.
Dr. Thompson, we can come back to you if that's okay. Let's go right into Dr. Tamara Stevenson. You're muted, Dr.
I'm
Stevenson.
muted. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. And what critical race theory is about, from my understanding, is that it is, first of all, a legitimate lane of academic study. Critical race theory has been used to examine how institutional racism manifests in policy and practice to advantage certain racial groups and disadvantage other racial groups. I like to think of it as well as how policy or course of action adopted or proposed by a government, party, business, or individual responds to identity. And that was the core idea, I think, of those pioneering scholars in the late 1970s and 1980s, thinking about these policies like affirmative action, for example, designed to do a particular thing, but quickly those ideas and policies rescinded to shift back to inequities across race. I have a personal affinity for critical race theory. It literally gave me the words to articulate what I was observing and experiencing in my life, especially as I advanced in my schooling and my career. It gave me words and understanding of how inequities were being illuminated, why I was the only person of color, the only Black woman in my college classroom, in the workplaces I've been in, including as Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Westminster College. So thinking about how policy responds to identity and how critical race theory is using a racialized lens to illuminate inequity in policy.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. Now, can we go back to Dr. Thompson? You're muted, Dr. Thompson.
Oh, here. I don't know why it's muting like that. Okay.
Okay, go ahead, Dr. Thompson.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can.
Excellent, thank you. I appreciate everything that Dr. Tamara Stevenson had spoke on critical race theory. Critical race theory, from my understanding, is an academic framework created by legal scholars in the 1970s and 80s. And it looks at that racism isn't just the product of an individual bias, but that it is also embedded in legal systems and policies. Also, Gloria Latson-Billin and other scholars says that CRT analyzes the role of race and racism in perpetuating social disparities between dominant and marginalized racial groups. And when we look at that, critical race theory then is a tool that looks at inequities. It is not the curriculum that is taught in school. This tool informs us where inequities exist. So I think most people need to know that critical race theory is not a curriculum. It is not a program. It is a tool that informs us of where inequities exist. Then we look at the data to address these inequities, to ensure that in our schools, all students have opportunity for educational equity and excellence, regardless of race, religion, language, socioeconomics, ability, and gender. And later I'll talk about some of the programs and how we see that play out. But if we'll look at this through our equity lenses, this will better help us to understand what critical race theory is and what it is not. So it is a tool that informs us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson.
You're welcome.
At this time, Dr. Christy, if you don't mind.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you again for the invitation to have this conversation. For me, critical race theory is an important tool. And as both Dr. Stevenson and Dr. Thompson have already stated, I have an affinity to critical race theory. I always tell people I am a critical race theorist. I use that theory in my dissertation. And I was first introduced to this theory When I first heard about it, I'm like, oh my goodness, here's something that can help to explain what I was seeing in education. I'm an educator. I look at data all the time. We were just in the middle of looking at the achievement gap and trying to understand the disproportionate rates of suspensions with boys and girls of color and all the disparities that we saw in education. And then here pops up critical race theory as a way for me as an administrator to be able to understand what's going on here, and then as a way for us to include that as part of our training. We use this as a lens, as a framework for analyzing the data that we see. And so it helps us then as we identify what's going on here. It helps us then to move to the why. So why is our data looking the way it is? Well, because of systemic racism. We have to get to that place. You just can't automatically look at data and see that there are some issues there. So CRT was a way for me to help to understand and help my teachers to understand what was going on. And as Dr. Thompson shared, it what did begin in the legal system, but it has application in education. As I said, in our spaces, it helps to explain the disparities that we see. Or at least partially explain them based on race. And I think it's a tool that is useful for all of us to be able to understand what's going on in our systems, our systems of oppression or racist systems. It is not a curriculum. It is not a lesson plan. And so when you hear people talking about, I don't want it taught, you don't teach critical race theory. All it does for me is shapes my thinking, my mindset, and helps to explain.
Thank you, Dr. Christy. I appreciate you. That is wonderful ideas and suggestions on how do we best address CRT. Dr. Bybee, if you don't mind going next.
Sure. First off, I'd just like to say how pleased and grateful I am to be on this panel with this group of distinguished scholars and activists and organizers who I know I've heard about. Some of you I know personally. I know Dr. Jackie personally from some of our work, but the rest of your names I've heard, and I have a lot of admiration for all the great work that you do. So I feel like the panelists have given a good background on some of the history of critical race theory. To get a little bit more, I guess, specific on it. It does come out of the 1970s, right, in the late 1970s, and one of the things that I think is for me is important about it is that it's responding in part to some disappointment about civil rights victories, right, and basically the gap between what these great victories like Brown v. Board of Education were supposed to accomplish and what they actually accomplished in reality. And perhaps the most famous of critical race theorists who wrote about the Brown v. Board of Education decision was a Harvard law professor and former NAACP lawyer, actually named Derek Bell. And again, in terms of what CRT asserts, right, I feel like the other panelists have discussed that. It talks about institutional racism. The racism is commonplace, that it's not aberrant in society, right? That again, these civil rights victories have not fulfilled their promises, right? It speaks back against this idea of color blindness, right? And also, and this is an important part for me, is that it really focuses on centering the stories of the marginalized, right? And speaking back to dominant or majoritarian narratives through counter storytelling, right, about marginalized folks. I think perhaps the most well-known concept in CRT is Bell's principle of interest convergence, which states, and I'll quote him here, he says that the interests of Blacks in achieving racial equality will be accommodated only when it converges with the interests of whites. And part of the way that he comes to this idea of interest convergence is through, you know, his analysis and theorizing about the Brown v. Board of Education ruling, right? And his argument that ruling that desegregated schools wasn't necessarily the result of some great moral leap forward, but that it also had to do with quelling racial unrest in the United States, as well as winning the Cold War, right? And convincing, nations who were in the developing world, who were trying to decide who they wanted to ally with, right? That to ally with us, right? And and again, so it gains prominence in initially, so it's developed in the law, and then it starts to be adopted into educational research and other fields starting in the 1990s. But where you'll see it now is mostly in law schools and in other graduate schools, primarily graduate schools of education. And so again, you can see why, like, the idea that it's being taught to schools, that that teachers are doing like read alouds about critical race theory with second graders. It's just a silly idea and doesn't really have any basis in reality.
Thank you, Dr. Bybee. Question number 2, and I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we all face, and that is, how do we talk about critical race theory with family and friends who may have heard some misinformation or who are feeling afraid of critical race theory? Let's start with Dr. Stevenson at this time.
So my fellow panelists are going to take a different angle than I will. I am clearly an organizational communication, rhetorical infrastructure administrator scholar. So I really come at these conversations from a policy and practice standpoint versus the esoteric, we all should get along. Mm-hmm. And that certainly has a place. There needs to be balance there. So honestly, I think there should be a standard of how information is discussed. Now, am I expecting family and friend, well, maybe some of my family and friends, because they are brilliant people, to give me an entire dissertation on the particular topic? No. But I just curiously browsed Utah Language Arts Corps, even when there were conversations in the state legislature talking about a resolution to ban CRT and to sadly try to impose some unnecessary oversights on how K-12 teachers engage in professional development. And what I found was for the Utah Language Arts Corps, English Language Arts grade 7. And I had to remember that at grade 7, you're about 12 years old. And those informational text standards talk about citing sources. So again, not asking family and friends to give me a diatribe or a list of references on what they're reading to inform their thinking about critical race theory, but can we at least agree on some sort of credible standard of how on an explanation of critical race theory. So I think I would ask, where are you getting your information? Again, I'm a communication instructor, professional. And so where are you getting your information? How can we discern if that source is credible?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Stevenson.
Can I jump in real quick here? Sorry,
sure.
Are we allowed to do this? I don't know if we're all going in order.
You can. I think, well, yeah, let's have you jump in, and then we'll go to Christy. Go ahead, go right ahead.
I just think Dr. Tamara's point here is really important, and I wanted to put a point on it, and that's because what I have seen. So just to, I don't necessarily, critical race theory is really important to me. I've used it in my work. It's incredibly influential. It is a niche enough theory that I don't necessarily identify myself. I have scholars and friends that are like, I'm a critical race scholar, right? I don't necessarily put myself in that camp, but I came to this conversation because what I noted was just a lot of misinformation from official looking sources, right? From quote unquote think tanks, conservative right-wing think tanks, you know, that are sponsored by like Hillsdale College or something like that. And they'll say things like, well, critical race theory started in the gulags of Russia or something crazy like that. And it's got no basis in reality, right? And it wouldn't be published in any reputable publication. It wouldn't pass peer review in any journal, right? But it's literally being circulated in schools. It's being put in teachers, you know, boxes. It's being emailed around. And so I think, again, to Dr. Tamara's point, which I think is really important, there has been a concerted effort to misinform people about not only where the theory is applied, right? That's applied in schools, which you said that it's not, but what it is, right? You know, and again, I just wanted to place a fine point on that. We need to work against that misinformation.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Bybee. And let's go ahead with Dr. Christy.
Okay. Yes, as Dr. Bybee just said, and Dr. Stevenson, it is nothing. It's not a conversation we would have around the dinner table. So I don't expect families to be talking about, what did you learn in critical race theory today? It's not like that. It's about, you know, just understanding the system of racism that we have within our schools. So maybe a conversation could be, and how teachers could handle it using the knowledge or the framework of CRT, is as we're teaching about, for example, the Black Wall Street. That's on everybody's mind right now. At least I hope it is. But as we're talking about that, and we want teachers to teach the truth, and as we are sharing this information with our students, you know, and I think what we've done for a long time is we've just given this surface information, if any at all. So we have this information about the Black Wall Street. So kids are going to be inquisitive. They're going to ask questions. So why? What happened? And if we don't have a framework for understanding this whole systemic racism and white supremacy, then we are left with no explanation for our kids. We are left with confusion, misinformation. And so the CRT then provides that support for helping us to at least talk about some of these things. There are so many different massacres and issues, historical events that have happened in our country that we want to be told. We want the truth to be told, but we're going to have a framework background to be able to teach it, and to be for teachers to understand it. Can't teach what you don't know. So anyway, that's how we talk about it around the dinner table, you know, or with our family and friends. So, you know, help me understand what you know about that, you know.
Well said, Dr. Christy. Dr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Yapias. I'm in agreement with all my distinguished panel members. And I actually had this happen to me twice in the last week or two, where family and friends have said, so what is this CRT? And they'll say, we've heard about it on the news, or our neighbors are putting up signs, you know, even signs that say building for unity. Mm-hmm. And so I explained to them that CRT, again, is not a program, that it's not a curriculum, that it's the lens at which we look through to address inequities. Then when I began to share with them what some of the inequities are, they say, oh, I'll say now, let's look at the graduation for our students of color versus our white students. Are our students graduating as higher level? And they'll say, oh, yes. And I'll say, well, now let's look at the school to prison pipeline. And they'll think about that for a moment. And I said, our students of color are more severely disciplined than white students, and then also our students with disability and students of color more severely disciplined. And that leads to that school to prison pipeline. And then with some of our church members that we would go and visit the prisons, I would remind them, what inequities do we see right there in the prison? We see more prisoners of color, although we have lower populations here in the state of Utah. And then I'll ask them, what about our students of color in the advanced placement classes? And that's underrepresented, but then we have overrepresentation of students of color in special education. Then we'll talk about high expectations and low expectations. And one that really gets them is, and they understand it perfectly. And I've heard some of our friends say, I've gone through the whole school system and not seen one teacher of color or had a Black teacher or Hispanic teacher, a Native American teacher teach me. So we talk about diverse hiring practices too. With those examples, they began to get it and say, we do need more teachers for all of our students that reflect our diverse population. So they're asking, but once they hear what it is, then they say, that makes sense to me. And then they hear examples, and not only the examples I give them, but they begin to bring up examples of their own. And I'll say, yes. So they say, this isn't a bad thing. This is a good thing because we can address the inequities.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Thompson.
You're welcome.
Dr. Bybee, would you like to elaborate a little? You have about probably a minute, if you don't mind. Anything else? If not, we can move into the third question.
Yeah, so I think 4 points for me that are really important. One is that CRT is a valuable framework for examining equity, but it's not being taught in K-12 schools, just to dispel that myth. Very importantly, CRT is currently being conflated with efforts to ensure equity in schools, right? Because it's not actually being taught in schools, the misinformers, the folks spreading the misinformation have to find something that they can call CRT. So they find anything having to do with equity, diversity, and inclusion, and they say that, oh, that's where it's coming in, right? And that the efforts to undermine equity in schools should concern all parents, because that affects every child. And we can get more into that, later on. And finally, the fourth point is that efforts to ban an idea should concern every citizen, right? I cannot think of a time in my lifetime when I have seen the levers of power used so intentionally to ban an idea, not just from schools, but from public service, from higher education, right? And I mean, this is really unprecedented territory, and I think we should remind folks of that.
Thank you, Dr. Bybee. So our third question: what is being done to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion in our schools? And I think that's something powerful, because what we're talking about is all students. And so let's start with Dr. Christy at this time.
Okay, so I think what Dr. Bybee just said, we're combining everything. CRT is equity, diversity, inclusion. And so what we have to have when we're talking about equity, I'm gonna start there, is an understanding of what equity is. Equity is not equality. Equity is a means for us to get to equality. And so when we're looking at equity, it could be a program, resources that would help to eliminate the disparities that are revealed via our CRT examination of the data. But anyway, once we understand that there are some inequities, there are some disparities, then we apply equity, or we apply tools that will help us to reach the equality. We want all students. We want high expectations for all students. We want the outcomes to be where all students graduate high school. Or we want all students to be able to take courses in math so they can go to college. Well, if all students aren't doing that, we've got to look at the data to see who has not been given that opportunity, who is not making it. What do we do? What are the equitable practices that will help all students to reach the high expectation? And so therefore we have to put in place some types of support, resources, additional help so that all students can reach the mark. And I always throw out this example of MESA. We've had MESA in our state for almost 30 years. MESA was, and it's a statewide model of equity where we identified the concerns that we had around math, science, and students of color. We realized that students of color were not taking the higher level math courses and therefore didn't have the same outcomes as their white counterparts. So MESA was set up, designed to give students, underrepresented students, marginalized students, that math, science, engineering support. And actually there was even some classes where they got that extra help so that they could have the similar outcome as their peers. So we have, we just have to look at, and for me, it's all about looking at the data. What does the data tell us? What do we need to do?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Christy. Let's go to Dr. Bybee, and then we'll go to Dr. Stevenson after that.
So in terms of what's being done to promote equity in our schools, just returning to this idea of equity, because I think it really is important, and it's misunderstood. And just this to build off what Dr. Christy has mentioned. So if we were to contrast equity versus equality, right? Equality is every student gets the same thing. Equity is, again, to make it really, is that students get what they need to be successful, right? And it really is, it's a tool to achieve equality, right? Equity is. And so, we have, one of the things that's been really concerning about this debate is I have heard, in local school board meetings where I live in Provo, at State Board of Education meetings, parents actually saying things like, I don't think we should focus on equity. We should focus on equality, right? Without really understanding that if every student gets the same thing, that can actually be really marginalizing, right? If you have students, no student is going to be at the same place in terms of their reading, in terms of their math, right? We have students with disabilities, and if you're saying that we can only apply the same approach to each of these students, it's not good teaching, and it's really oppressive, right? And I mean, you really have in either whether you're thinking about like a smaller classroom sense or a larger school sense, there are teachers thinking about equity, right? Millions of teachers thinking about it every day, right? We can always do better, right? But they're thinking about how to fairly divide their time between those students who are maybe a little bit more advanced in reading versus those students who need help, students who are that way in math, right? And so on and so forth. And so it's just a vital principle. And again, for me, very alarming when I see it under attack in schools. In my own work as a teacher educator, right? We talk about equity, we talk about culturally relevant approaches to teaching students. That's how I'm actually required to do that by our accrediting organizations to help prepare students to teach equitably. Then when they go into some of our local districts, we actually have, diversity and equity coordinators that will. So here in Provo, I know our diversity and equity coordinator, Brian Yazzie, pretty well. And I know he's done things like organize multicultural advisory committees, and they've had a speaker series, and just done all kinds of things to try and involve the community to dig in, to create more equitable environments for students, right? And again, I think undermining that work is, in especially based on some misinformation about CRT, it's just not good for anyone.
Thank you, Dr. Bybee. Dr. Stevenson.
Yes, just a couple of things. But before I get to those, I just want to make sure that I disrupt what I sense is this deficit modeling of students of color in education, that there is this inherent belief or sense that students of color, Black students in particular, cannot be successful in schools. They certainly can. And critical race theory illuminates the structural issues of that, of those performance issues, right? We can talk about funding of schools, underfunded schools. We can talk about poor quality of teachers, right? And that comes out through the lack of rigor that they bring to the curriculum, the implicit biases that they may have for particular student groups, where they won't engage them, or they will mistreat them, or these students will get labeled as needing special education, or that they have these various labels put on them that walk with them throughout their K-12 education and even into higher education. So I would just want to make sure I stir the pot on that to say, our children can be successful in schools. They need the right environments. They need the right people around them. And even when they may be bringing issues to the classroom, they are still capable of learning. And that's, again, what CRT, particularly the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings and what was his name? I'm looking at the title article in my head, and I think he co-authored it with Gloria Ladson-Billings. And the first name is James
Tate.
Charles
Tate.
Tate.
Yes.
Yeah.
William
That goes all into that. So I just want to make sure that that is on record, that students of color can certainly be successful. I am a product of a public school system, and I think I got my family, this world got a really good investment in me. With that said, we're talking about what is being done to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion in schools. I kind of want to talk about a bit about the why. And it takes me back again, I'm coming at this from the higher ed angle, but I do have experience working in the K-12 system at the regional level. Going back to the 2003 Supreme Court rulings on the University of Michigan affirmative action cases. And such a wealth of research came out of those cases in which the University of Michigan was sued because they used affirmative action in both their graduate and undergraduate, the graduate law school programs. But the foundational outcome of that experience was that diversity benefits everyone, including white students. Students come to these schools, they come to college, coming from these monolithic environments for the most part. Everybody looks like everybody else. And so then they get to college or come to these, school districts, and they may meet and encounter classmates who are different from them in many ways, including race, gender identity and expression, sexual identity and expression, ability, and even political affiliation and cultural backgrounds and perspectives. And we know that diversity benefits everyone to prepare these students for an ever-changing diverse world, which again, the Gardner Institute's new case book on diversity in Utah is changing. Utah is becoming more diverse much more quickly than most anticipated. So in higher education, what's happening? We're creating and facilitating and cultivating spaces for students to get together and learn and meet each other in these safe, and I'll say brave spaces. We've learned that you can't just throw students in the gym and expect them to just automatically mingle, right? We gotta tease them out a little bit. We gotta create some exercises where they don't quite know that what we're doing, but it's fun, so they'll do it. And of course, we require students to take courses that emphasize diversity, that talk about diversity, power, and difference. We encourage our professors to expand their curricular offerings, their readings and their assignments that are culturally relevant and responsive to the students in their classes. And we know that as Utah is becoming, again, more racially and ethnically diverse, students of all ages do their best learning when they are in schools and classes that cultivate a sense of belonging.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. Dr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Yapias. I've heard so much that is making me feel very excited. And I first of all wanted to thank Dr. Stevenson, because our students are brilliant and we want everyone to have high expectations for all of them, because we do. we know what they are capable of. Also, Dr. Christy, thank you, because the data continues to inform us. And I'll talk about programs we have based on that data. And Dr. Bybee, thank you about equity versus equality. And I'm happy you mentioned Brian Yazzie and the speaker series that he's going to continue to have. Today, I was at the Leonardo at the Sorting Out Race exhibit where they were looking at racial artifacts with a group of fourth graders. Now they tell me they're going to fifth grade. And we were talking about equity and equality and racism and prejudice and discrimination. And one student had on a pair of really cool red shoes. And I said, all of you are going to get shoes today. And their eyes lit up. And I said, oh, just hypothetically speaking. And I said, I asked the one student that had the red shoes on, what size do you wear? And he said a 5. And I said, well, you're all going to get a 5. And they said, no. One student said she even wore a size 1, one said a size 4. So one student said, no, we have to get what fits us, what belongs. And that's what we're talking about when Dr. Bybee said equity is students get what they need to be successful. And then when we looked at the data and how the data informs us, we looked at programs such as our Latino in Action in our school district. We noticed that several years back, our Latino students weren't graduating as high a rate. When Latino in Action came in, that we're looking at almost 100% graduation rate or very close to that because of that outstanding program, which also replicated itself with people of Pacific. Dr. Christy talked about MESA, where we looked at addressing underrepresentation for girls and students of color in math. And it's neat to see MESA step at the college and universities. And then Dr. Christy is a huge component of the program AVID, Advancement via Individual Determination, provides professional learning for educators to close the opportunity gaps and improve college and career readiness for our high school, middle school students, especially those traditionally underrepresented in higher ed, some that are the first in their family to go on to college. We look at professional development being a huge part. The data tells us that our teachers cannot teach what they do not know. So we look at training and provide cultural responsive teaching, not CRT, but CRT or culturally responsive teaching. Training such as REACH, respecting ethnic and cultural heritage, where we use a 5-step approach with the basic principles of multiple perspectives. Culture is something everyone has, building cultural bridges, head, heart, hands for healing, and co-responsibility. What else is being done to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion in our schools is in the works right now, as we're looking to have ethnic studies infused in our K-12, social studies, and other core for our students, along with teacher training. We are working on this and hope to have legislation passed soon, drafted and passed in this area, so that it has funding attached to it, that it has training for our educators, and that we do have ethnic studies in our curriculum. We feel that education is the key to our better future.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Doctor.
You're welcome.
I want to, at this time, we're halfway through, but I want to also take the opportunity to thank our sponsors, the NAACP of Salt Lake Branch and the Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, Inc., and supported by the Better Utah Institute, ACLU of Utah, and the NAACP Ogden Branch. Once again, thank you to each and every one of you, our panelists. And we'll now go to the next 3 questions that we have. And we'll start with Dr. Bybee, and we'll go into Dr. Stevenson after that. The question is, why do you think there's so much talk about banning CRT in schools?
This is a great question. To be honest, for me, it kind of came out of nowhere. Like I have a friend who's a state legislator in Texas, actually a friend from my PhD program. And we're like friends on social media. And she sent a message saying like, hey, like they're trying to ban CRT in Texas, right? And which seemed really odd so that was maybe about a month ago, maybe more. So that's when I really started following it. I do know that there has been on the far right, there have been it's been a boogeyman for a little while, right? Like during the Trump era, it was banned in federal training, right? And sponsored by the federal government. Long before that, I do recall, an effort to paint Barack Obama as a radical based on the fact that he had Derek Bell as a professor. But I don't quite know the genealogy, right? And that would be like a fascinating thing for someone to write up. I would love to read that. But I mean, in a I guess to put it succinctly, I think that it's been identified as a really successful wedge issue to get folks to the polls, right? In certain red states, right? And and there is, like I said, there is an infrastructure of quote unquote think tanks publishing quote unquote white papers about this that are then covered in conservative media. And so there is, and it's again, I've just only dipped my toe into it a little bit as I've tried to understand what's going on. And it is sort of this, again, alternative narrative about this thing that is taking over schools that has no basis in reality. But it is firing people up. And I think that's part of the reason that folks keep on talking about it. In a general sense, like I feel like there is I guess in a kind of a more, in a general sense, since we have been talking about racial justice with the death of George Floyd and these other really high profile police killings, I believe that there's a segment of the US population that's really uncomfortable with this. And I feel like banning CRT in schools is a way to put a finger on some of that discomfort and respond to it, even though that connection is tenuous at best. I think so. Yeah, that's my opinion about where it's coming from.
Thank you, Dr. Bybee. Dr. Stevenson, and then we will go to Dr. Thompson and Dr. Christy after that. Thank you.
I totally agree with Dr. Bybee that it would be a fascinating read to follow kind of the trajectory of this momentum, this wacky momentum of how we got from American history and its already whitewashed version to critical race theory is this radical takeover of the country, and it's just going to ruin everything for everybody. And so Dr. Bybee, you mentioned the memo that came out, the Executive Order 13950. I remember it because it made me wonder if my work would be affected as the Chief Diversity Officer at Westminster College. Would I be able to continue developing professional development trainings and the like? And then the following memo from the Office of Management and Budget under the Trump administration that pretty much eliminated any kind of content or training involving white privilege and critical race theory, that would impact funding for those federal contractors involved in those types of training. But I think we can also go back to the introduction of the 1619 project that the New York Times developed that came out in August 2019 to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved Africans arriving in colonial Virginia. And so now you have this major writing, Pulitzer Prize winning journalistic enterprise. Again, I was a journalism major in undergraduate school, so just loved seeing this, being led by a Black woman, Nicole Hannah-Jones, and there's an entire situation going on with her and her tenure at a North Carolina university. And this clearly recenters how American history is perceived taught, it really says, look, you want to know how race and racism is a big deal. We had enslaved Africans brought to this country, and generations continued, and we're still feeling the effects of those policies. We're still feeling the effects of those legalities of slavery, taking us back to Juneteenth today. So this is our full circle in so many ways. So why is there so much talk banning on CRT as well? There's this ongoing effort to control these narratives. However, the internet is a big place. The internet has created so many more avenues for people to tell their lived experiences, their stories. Someone in one part of the country or the world can read a story or a lived experience from someone in Utah and go, the same thing happened to me. Those people aren't conspiring to each other, they don't even know each other, but yet they're able to connect in ways and talk about things and think about things. And so I think there's a fervor to try to squash realities, right? To create this utopia that just doesn't exist. It's just how, as Dr. Bybee been saying it, it's not based in reality. So I think for those two reasons, this is where this fervor is coming from.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. Dr. Thompson, and then Dr. Christy.
I'm in agreement with Dr. Bybee and Dr. Stevenson. And I believe that after the brutal murder of George Floyd last year, almost a year ago, that people woke up. A lot of people woke up, especially our youth. A lot of white youth marching in the streets with Black youth and youth of all races. And we were coming together. And as we were coming together shortly afterwards, here comes that executive order, something that was very divisive to keep us separated, something that's preparing for what's going to happen as we're looking at elections in 2022. We hear them talking about the 1619 project. Anytime we start to come in agreement that we must talk about racism, we must address racism so that we can grow, that we can heal, that we can grow forward and learn from it, but we cannot avoid it. I see too that it's a lack of awareness, that where a lot of miscommunication and fear is driving this. We have gone to school board meetings and parents have spoke up on behalf of CRT as well as those that don't believe in it. And after these parents have spoke up, others have come over and say, I realize I haven't been educated in this area. This now makes sense to me. We went to the Capitol before that resolution was signed, that day that it was going to be signed, with educational equity directors and others. And as we got a chance to tell the stories and to tell the narratives and to explain what CRT is, there was a group of parents that were standing there and they said, we would not be standing here today if we had have understood this more fully. We understand now that we need to go back and have more research done in this area. But I think that once we continue to educate about the benefits of CRT and recognize and realize and address it, then we recognize that it benefits all of us, that we're all in this together. And so again, to break down that miscommunication and that fear and educate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. Dr. Christy?
So I echo everything that's been said. The misinformation, the living with the unrealities of who we think we are. I just think it's fear. It is just basic fear. There's a fear of talking about race. There's a fear of the truth coming out. Again, as we've been talking about historical truths, I've heard so many stories now about massacres that I didn't even know existed in our country's history. They have been covered up. So there's this fear that if we talk about the R word, which is race, and I think that's how CRT got picked because it had race in the title, maybe, I don't know, but the total misinformation about CRT and couple that with what what the general population, the conservative right, are fearing: loss of power and control. I think the numbers in our country is becoming more and more diverse, and there's fear, and they don't want the truth to come out because there's fear. I don't know, maybe retribution. I don't know, but is the bottom line is fear and miseducation.
Thank you, Dr. Christy. And what I hear, and thank you to all of our panelists, the powerful, the word that keeps coming out is educate, educate.
Mhm.
And the one thing that I keep hearing is also, it will benefit all. Thank you for that.
Mm.
Now, the next question, we will start with Dr. Thompson, and we'll go to Dr. Bybee. And this one, I think it kind of leads up to what we've been talking about. And that is, what would you say to those critics or Utah legislators who say that the Utah State Board of Education review its standards for curriculum and ensure that the following concepts are not included in the curriculum standards: that race is inherently superior or inferior to another race, that an individual should be discriminated against or received adverse treatment because of their individual race, or that an individual's moral character is determined by their individual's race?
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Yapias. I would say that first, to these legislators, this is not something new to us, that this has been our lifetime work along with NAACP and other civil rights organizations. I would let them know that I believe that it is our diversity that enriches us and our commonalities that bring us closer together. That I feel that it is important that we teach a truthful approach to history. We do not want to see any race feeling superior or inferior. But if we were to look historically, that's exactly what has happened. And we want to address that so that it does not happen again. We want to say to the legislators, we are not rewriting history, but filling in the missing pages of the history book. That we must not only tell his story, but her story and our story too. We must address the injustices. Yes, there are things that we have to be proud of, but there are things that we are not proud of, and we must address it. It is only then that we can begin to learn, listen, love, heal, and grow stronger together. So again, we are not teaching in the schools that one race is inferior or superior to another. We know that they are talking a lot about Dr. King's quotes about color blindness, and that we must not judge people based on the color of their skin, but rather on the content of their character. But I will say to them also that we are not of the color blindness theory. We believe that do not discriminate based on race, but do see our color and appreciate who we are. It is a part of our culture. So there's still a lot of education to be done, and that we cannot just look at one individual. We have to look systemically at the whole system. We have to look at this whole system of racism. We can't just take it apart that way. We've got to look at it systemically as well. Thank you.
Dr. Bybee?
Yeah, and I one thing, this is sort of to your last question, but is also related to this one. I think what part of the reason that there is so much talk about banning is that a systems approach of looking at racism or really any system of oppression undermines the myth of the rugged individual, right? And there's a lot of myth making in our history. I think especially, across the political spectrum, but especially on the right, that wants to maintain a focus on the individual, right? And CRT challenges that, right? It challenges that perspective. In terms of what I would say to Utah legislators, yeah, I think it is important. Again, so this debate is, as we've talked about, it's about CRT, but it's also not about CRT, right? It's both. because they're not actually talking about critical race theory, right? And I think in the same way, the resolution, it is about what it says on its face, but underlying it, there are some assumptions. And I think it's really important. And if you listen to the USBE meetings, or there was a education committee meeting I was listening to yesterday. If you actually listen to those, there are some underlying assumptions in this debate, and I think it's important to identify what those are and just name them. And one of the assumptions is that students of color are not the victims of racism anymore, that the victims of racism are white students, and that the way that they experience racism is by feeling supposed shame when they learn about history involving racism. And that in fact, talking about race is a form of racism against white students. That's the underlying assumption of how this argument is being framed. Some of the other things, right? Like that MLK believed we should be colorblind and not look at systems, right? Not true, right? Students experience racism through CRT, right? And teachers are talking about CRT. CRT comes from Marxism, and teachers are using CRT as a way to make elementary school students Marxists, right? It's silly, but you have to name it, right? You have to name what they're talking around it, but these are the underlying assumptions. That equity is taking away resources from white students and unfairly giving them to brown and black students, right? And then along with equity, things like social and emotional learning, culturally relevant pedagogy, multiculturalism, all of these are ways of doing stealth critical race theory, right? None of them are true, right? In fact, when we undermine equity in schools, which is what is happening, right? So even though this resolution has language about individuals being discriminated against or reverse adverse treatment, the way that districts are responding downstream is that they're saying, okay, I had an anti-bias training that actually was about a lot more than race. I'm going to cancel that now, right? Because this message has been sent that's not okay anymore, right? I think we need to communicate the harmful effects of that, not just for BIPOC students, but for our LGBTQ students, our students with disabilities, right? Our English learner students, like any student who doesn't fit the mold, which in some sense is every student, right? Is going to be harmed by efforts to undermine equity. And beyond that, again, that's sort of the school context. But again, the broader context of banning an idea is really scary. It's really scary. I mean, I toggle between like the silliness and the scariness of it. And it is unprecedented for the government to be this, in my lifetime, in my memory, to be this involved and to be using all of the levers of power available to it to keep people from talking about an idea. And that that should make advocates for civil liberties, whether we're in schools or not, stand up and take notice.
Thank you, Dr. Bybee. Dr. Thompson, right? And then Dr. Christy, and
Okay.
then Dr. Stevenson.
Yes, Mr. Yapias, I think I started. Okay, thank you.
Dr. Christy, sorry, my apologies.
That's okay.
Well, my message to the legislators again is you're misinformed. You need to understand what it is you are addressing when we put language like that in the resolution. The work that equity leaders and our schools are doing around equity, whether it's culturally responsive, relevant teaching, curriculum practices, it's to benefit all of our students. And it's not about trying to pit one race against another. Again, I think it's the misinformation that's out there. We heard recently that the language that is in our state our school board rule is the same that's being used across the country in conservative rights states. I mean, the same language. So what does that mean? It means somebody didn't do any research to kind of come up with their own local practices, but it's also the language of fear. Again, as I said, it's trying to pit us against each other. And if we want to talk about unification and unifying our communities, we got to talk the truth so that we come to an understanding about who we are as Americans, our historical past. And it's okay, we made some mistakes in the past, but we got to do something about it. We can't let them sit as they are. And so my advice is to gain some knowledge, do some reading, talk to some people, understand what this is all about. It's about fairness and justice. And that's what we want for all of us. And again, fear just promotes this.
Thank you. Dr. Stevenson?
I so appreciate the remarks from my fellow panelists tonight. I come at this work from a critical perspective, which means I deeply inquire about the phenomenon being studied. It doesn't mean that I am being accusatory or destructive in my analysis, but I am deeply inquiring into the work. With that said, I would graciously ask Utah legislators to model what is expected of 7th grade students and the language arts core.
Amen.
That calls for citing your sources, defining your terms. So what is meant by inferior and superior? What is meant by adverse treatment? What is meant by moral character? How is that even a part of curriculum standards? Clearly the data tells a different story. So should curriculum standards be written from an aspirational perspective where there is no difference in superiority or inferiority across race? Because we got data that says much different. And it's not attitudinal data. It is behavioral data. It is outcomes. It is learning outcomes. It is educational attainment, for example. So this is rhetorical theater. And there are people that are more intelligent and have higher expectations about what they want their students, their children that they're sending to schools to be able to do to prepare them for college or a trade or to go on a mission or to go to serve in a volunteer capacity, wherever they want to go. And that means writing and having and reviewing curriculum standards by experts and writing them in ways that are going to produce equitable outcomes.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. Again, I want to take this opportunity to thank our Juneteenth celebration panel. You guys are amazing. I just received a wealth of information tonight, and we have one more question. But I also want to thank our sponsors, the NAACP Salt Lake branch and the Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Inc. and that is supported by the Better Utah Institute, ACLU of Utah, and the NAACP Ogden branch. Once again, now we're to our last question, and I'd like to start with Dr. Christy at this time. And the question is, in your final words, what would you like to say to parents about CRT?
Okay. It is not being taught in your child's classroom. CRT is not a curriculum. It is not a lesson. CRT is just a theoretical framework. It's a theory that helps us understand the impact of systemic racism on various institutions in our country. The educational advantages that we get from looking at CRT help us to identify and address the disparities that we see in school, in our classrooms. And so as your teachers are being trained in equity, around equity issues. They're beginning to understand how to address these inequities that will benefit all children in the end, but primarily the disparities that we see in our classrooms. So again, CRT is not being taught in our classrooms.
Dr. Stevenson.
I was hoping I'd have a little more time to process. But,
I can come back to you if you'd
no,
like.
that's okay. No,
Okay.
I'll gladly share. As much as we've been talking about what critical race theory is and isn't, where it's being taught and where it isn't, all accurate, right? All accurate. It's not a curriculum, it's not a program, it's not being taught to second graders. And certainly to Dr. Bybee's point about the suppression of ideas is a dangerous place to be in. And I hope that parents will appreciate give their children the love of learning and recognize that it's okay to be exposed to different ideas, but when there is a healthy balance of inquiry, that, my goodness, you're contributing to the development of productive citizens in society. We don't have to agree on everything, but my goodness, I would love to be able to see college students who aren't afraid to inquire, because we learn so much more, so much healthier. We gain in confidence. We're able to be world-class citizens, and the U.S. can get to that place of being a highly respected and recognized knowledge base. So I just would want parents to focus on their children's learning and development, and use that righteous energy to engage productively in civic engagement. Take your students with you when you go vote. Sit with your students when you're writing letters to your legislator about things that you're not so pleased about, but those things that you kind of do appreciate that they're doing. And prompting all around you to be thoughtful about the information that they're absorbing and that they're guiding their decision making on. And we just love to see students think and ask questions, and it's just for the betterment of everyone. So less about CRT, more about creating healthy learning environments for students.
Thank you. Well said. Dr. Thompson, and then Dr. Bybee.
Thank you, Mr. Yapias. Wow, that was powerful as we prepare our students to be the best that they can be. I'm in agreement. So I would like to say to parents, first of all, parents, we appreciate you. We know that you want the best for your students, and we do too. We are also parents and grandparents and teachers and educators and community members. We heard said that we live in a diverse world. Parents, continue to learn about these topics. You're learning now about CRT and what it addresses. We echo that it is not a curriculum that is taught in school, but a tool to look at inequities. The data is then used to address inequities around race, religion, gender, language, students who are differently abled. Let us remember that the African proverb says it takes a village to raise a child. Dr. Stevenson said it so beautiful. We are preparing our children to be citizens of the global world. Chief Sitting Bull said, let us put our minds together to see what life we can make for our children. And then in closing, I'd like to say, this is another African proverb that my friends often use. We've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. If we want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Parents, legislators, community members, educators, let's go together in this journey. When we go together, we are stronger, and this benefits all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're
Dr.
welcome.
Bybee.
I'd just like to say that I've learned so much and been so enriched by all the perspectives of again, this my wonderful co-panelists. I think if I were talking to parents about CRT, I think I would try a little interest convergence with them. I would say that it's actually in your interest to know about this history, right? You know, we could frame it in terms of economics, which like Utah loves to do, right? Our diverse workforce and so on and so forth. But there are deep personal benefits, right? To knowing this history, to being able to talk about it. There's a new book out by a poet and scholar named Clint Smith called How the Word is Passed. And he talks about this really false narratives about slavery, right? And where they have come from. And I think we're, you know, and in one really just poignant example, he talks about this prison in Louisiana called Angola that's actually built on the site of a former plantation. So this space that's primarily, you know, houses and well, it incarcerates Black men. They are, you know, they are primarily doing low wage labor in that on the side of this former place that housed slaves, right? And he brings up the point. He said, you know, if we were in Germany, right, and the German government built a prison that housed mainly Jewish people on the side of a former concentration camp, that would be unthinkable, right? But we do that. We do that in the U.S. and it's because we haven't dealt with it. We haven't dealt with it, right? And I'm really pleased that we finally have a Juneteenth holiday, but part of me is also like, why the hell did it take this long, right? For us to be able to get to this point. And I think it's because there's a lot of folks that haven't discovered that the ways that their lives and the lives of their children are going to be enriched by knowing this history, right? By knowing the truth, you know, by you know, if you're a white person or a white presenting person, if you feel shame or discomfort, right, around some of these issues, this CRT and learning this history is an opportunity to do something, to put that down, right? Because shame's not productive, right? It doesn't help anybody. And so I would along with some of my other panelists have done, I would invite you to get beyond the misinformation and learn the truth and create spaces where not just you, but also your children can again, put down the discomfort, put down the shame, and get to a place where we can work with each other to build a better society, right? And acknowledge again the way that people are trying to use your shame and discomfort to win elections. And don't let them do that, right? Don't let them do that. That's not in your best interest. It's not in the best interest of our students, and we can do better.
Thank you, Dr. Bybee. I'd like to see, does anyone else would like to add anything to that last question?
You know, I'd like to add, we talked about color blindness. There's a term called being color brave. And that's, you know, being willing to understand, learn, and to expose yourself to what's out there, you know, not hiding or retreating to color blindness and not wanting to, but be color brave.
That is great. That is great. Thank you, Dr. Christy. At this time, I'd like to wrap up our panelists, and I want to thank each and every one of you. But again, what a celebration today, Juneteenth celebration panel, understanding critical race theory. And I'd like to also send our deep appreciation to our president, Janetta Williams, president NAACP Salt Lake branch and its members, and the Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Inc. and its members. And once again, they do an outstanding job in our communities, and we appreciate you for all the work that you do. To our panelists, what a wealth of information this evening. I believe I've learned quite a bit myself. I think I've been empowered by your experience, by the work that you do in our community. And I think we need to do more of this, and that is educate. I like what each and every one of you have said. because at the end of the day, it has deep personal benefits to all. And I think that's what we keep hearing. And once again, thank you for this wonderful evening and for your time and your endless contribution to our community. Have a wonderful evening, and we appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yapias.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us.